If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is your small town dark secret story? We had a crazy rich guy from the 1600 to 1700s who saw people robbing a grave one night, so decided that when he died he would be laid to rest in the roof of a barn behind his house. He believed he'd only be dead for 30 years, so requested that they lock the barn and put the key in his coffin so he could get out, but nobody could get in. He requested that whoever inherited his house, fortune and belongings would have to give them back to him when he resurrected. He did actually get his wish, but of course he was never resurrected. People stole his bones and his house is a dentist now. This is also the town where that lady went viral going ham in the alcohol aisle in Aldi a few weeks ago. There was a woman who was cheating on her husband and got pregnant with him. When she has the child, it was quite clearly not the husband's child, so he kicked her out of the house. The woman broke down and went out drinking. Then when she was about to return to her husband, she picked her baby up, dropped it down a rubbish chute and left it there. The next morning she remembered what she did and went back to find the baby, but of course only people with access to the chute can go inside, so she had to wait hours, possibly days, for someone to unlock it and go inside. The baby was long dead by then. The woman killed herself shortly after. This developed into a ghost story later. People say you can hear the baby crying from inside the rubbish chute, and you can hear the woman crying on one of the stairways. A few years ago, a boy who was around my age, he would be 23 by now if he was still around, was up at his family cabin in the mountains of British Columbia, Canada. He was from Alberta and was living there to work at the ski resort during the winter holiday. One night he went to a party at a house and he only lived a 5 minutes walk from there. He was walking home with some friends, and when one of his friends looked back, he was gone. There was a search for him, but he wasn't found. There was no struggle or footprints in the snow. The police asked the people who were at the party, but a lot refused to answer what happened, or they didn't know. He's been missing for 3 years now, I think. His mom hasn't stopped looking for him, and she goes to their cabin once a month for a few days looking for him. She is aware at this point he is most likely dead, but she wants to find him so that she can be at peace. This isn't a secret story nor a part of my small town, but it is in a town where I did grow up going to for the winter holiday, and people think that the people who were at the party know exactly what happened to the kids, so there could possibly be a secret we don't know about. Small high school in Appalachia just off the interstate. In the early 2000s, MS-13 started moving in, recruiting, since apparently we were a great midpoint on the dog smuggling route to NYC and DC, few cops, not very sophisticated, no local gangs. But this was a place where half the pickups had rifle racks, and a lot of the poor kids hunted year-round as a key part of how the family ate. When I went there, you could actually see where the old rifle racks had been removed from the back of the school classrooms a few years earlier. A few gangers move in, start recruiting, selling hard drugs. Some nasty incidents happen. A few seniors from moonshine families say they want to join up and set up a meeting in a Walmart parking lot middle of the night with the gang senior leaders. They show up, start explaining to the gang guys that the town is off limits. As they're talking, about 100 pickups show up and start roaring around the lot, with rednecks in the backs rebel yelling and firing shotguns into the air. To top it off, 2 kids whose dads were 2 of the 4 local deputies borrowed their dad's squad cars, pulled in with the lights on, and just sat there. The moonshiners talking to the gangers say, "Oh, don't mind the cops, they're with us." Now I wasn't there, my family wasn't from around here since my parents has moved in only about 15 years earlier. But the story spread, and everyone knew who the Holler families were. And knowing a few of those kids, I believe that, while it may have been exaggerated, something did happen. And almost 20 years later, the towns 20 miles north and 10 miles south along the interstate both have major drug and crime issues that started a couple years after the alleged incident, while my old town has basically no issues. Those old families are still there. A freshman with Asperger's was being abused by his family at home. He was a problem child and got in trouble on purpose, but no one went too hard on him because of his home life. He was a well-loved kid at school and in the community. One day just before holiday break in December he was really sick, but his mom sent him to school anyway. Locked him out of the house. He decided to try and get into one of the empty houses down the street, through the chimney. Now this kid was the size of a second grader, but he was too big to fit through since chimneys taper down thinner. Mom never answered her phone when the school reported him missing. Went a whole day without reporting her kid missing. No one knew what happened to him. It was about a month and a half before we knew what happened to him. We all thought he ran away, was alive somewhere, maybe went to his sister's house. Nope. Dead in a chimney. The schools organized an entire week of counseling and such. They wore pink for a day and little pink ribbons on pins for him since his favorite color was pink. Everyone was hit really hard by it. That's how our small town started 2020. It hasn't gotten any better, as you can see. So weird that it's almost been a year now. Okay, so I just want to say this is 100% real. So there is a legit haunted house here. I live in Tepalcatepec, Michoacán, MX, BTW. It's a small town. About 6 years ago, these bandits that would go around killing people broke into the town. Luckily they were kicked out. But what they would do is that if someone didn't so as they said, they would take them to big house here in the town. Probably the biggest out of the town. They would take them to the basement and torture them and murder them. The house right now is unowned and whoever sleeps 5 nights in it gets to keep it. No one resists because they say it's haunted. There are dead bodies in the basement. And to get to one of my friend's house I have to pass it, and this is the scariest shit I have seen. One time the lights were flickering when I walked by and I saw a woman standing at the second floor bedroom window looking at me. Then the lights turned off and I couldn't see her anymore. They say they would also take women and abuse them there and murder them. Explains a bit more why there was a woman there. Also, right now the bandits are trying to get in again. So I am terrified of seeing the same thing unfold. I didn't live here when all of it happened 6 years ago. And I don't want to see it personally either. I found out about everything after middle school when me and my friends sat on the other side of the street in front of the house and told me everything. No one has ever stepped in that house to this day. So there's an old mental asylum. A young World War I veteran was admitted to the hospital. He'd been shot through the jaw and was suffering from shell shock. During his stay at the hospital, he began suffering from delusions, particularly about the doctor. He went to another hospital for a fortnight's leave, and while he was there he bought a gun and hitched a ride back to the asylum in a mail van. He arrived at the gates and found the doctor sitting on the veranda. So he shot the doctor and chased him through the grounds. During the chase, he came across a group of nurses and opened fire at them. One nurse was killed, and one was wounded. The hospital administrator confronted the patient with his gun and shot him through the hand, forcing his surrender. A wing of the hospital was named after the nurse, and a font was placed in the grounds of a local orphanage. The orphanage is believed to be haunted. The 160 kilograms marble font went missing for years, possibly decades. To the point where almost everyone had forgotten it ever existed. Until one day police received an anonymous tip-off to a random alleyway in a nearby city, and they found the font behind some bushes. It took 3 officers to lift it into a van. There are 3 buildings in town that are considered to be haunted: the hospital, the orphanage, and the girls' home. This was around 15 years ago, but there was a sheriff's deputy that was seemingly a really cool guy. Friendly, cracked a lot of great jokes, etc. He was working at the local high school as a school resource officer and was apparently almost universally well regarded. Well, it turns out that he repeatedly raped a 14-year-old. He told the boy that he'd kill his parents if he reported the officer. I don't remember all the details, but I believe this went on for weeks or months before it was found out and the officer was arrested and eventually went to prison. 15 years ago, the local district attorney called his longtime girlfriend and told her he was taking the day off from work and that he loved her. He parked his car in town and went for a stroll past the local shops. He hasn't been seen since. His car was found where he had parked it the next day. He had left his cell phone in the car, but his keys and wallet were missing. Later that year, his laptop, sans its hard drive, was found under a bridge at a nearby river. The hard drive was eventually discovered by a local woman walking along the bank of the river, but it was too damaged to recover any data from. Interestingly, investigators discovered that someone had done a search on his home computer for how to wreck a hard drive. Did he jump from a local bridge? Did he encounter someone whom he had prosecuted who did him harm? Or did he escape his life to start a new one? It happened to my dad. He had just learned to drive, and him and his buddies were passing through a Native American reserve, rural Canada. My dad was in the passenger seat, and they were going 40+ miles per hour. Out the open window, he heard a galloping on the gravel road. Now it sounded like it was right next to the car. He stuck his head out the window, and at first he didn't see anything. Then he glanced down. A Native American, headdress and everything, was running on all fours, keeping up with the car. My dad screamed, "Stop the car!" And Jeremy, thinking he was about to hit an elk, slammed on the brakes and they skidded to a stop, and the Native American kept running on all fours down the road. Upon my dad telling his father about this, my dad learned that he too had had a similar experience. His father was pike fishing on a canoe in a lake on the side of the road when he heard the same galloping, and saw a man running on all fours faster than a horse on the road. At his local high school, my dad told his class what happened. He found that almost half of the class had heard stories of the man from their parents, or had seen it himself. My dad says he's glad he moved back to the States away from that town. It's not much of a secret, but it is cool and scary and relatively famous cause it was on that show called Ghost Catchers or some shit. It was the famous show you see memes from. Anyway, it was a psychiatric hospital called Letchworth in Wijkstra, New York. It's still there today and can be visited if you're sneaky because there's a security guard that patrols the outskirts of the area. I've never been there at night and I would imagine it's scary, but in the daytime it's super cool. There's hella graffiti and old papers you can take. I have a sign-in sheet dated in like 1934 with a lot people's names and the different writing styles. The most interesting thing about it is that it looks like everybody just got up and left. There's essentially two parks. There's one that's next to a church and a parking lot. There's a walking path where a lot of people jog and walk their dogs, but going in the buildings is not permitted. If you don't want to risk it, you can just pop your head in, but if you go in, don't go stay in there for too long cause people will snitch and you get arrested on the spot. However, there's the famous ones that were on the show. It's hidden behind a little bit of forest across the street from the church. You'll be able to see the giant chimney where they burn the bodies and the ashes are still there. Those are the creepy ones. I have videos, but I how to upload them, I'm new to Reddit. Lastly, if nobody stole it, there's a notebook sitting on top a desk with a marker somewhere on the property, near the chimney. Write your name and the date. For the people that are skeptical, no, I haven't seen any ghosts since I took the paper. My hometown is a quiet small town that used to be a train stop / loading station back in the railroad days. The population right now is around 500, there's 5 or 6 bars, so as you can imagine it's full of drunks. Because it used to be a train loading station, there are obviously tracks that run through our town, and since growing up there, I'm 22 now, there have been about 30 to 40 suicides on the tracks alone. Most of the people get drunk, or high on meth and walk the tracks. Others put in headphones and just start walking. One of the cases from when I was younger, he filled his pockets with knives and ran down the tracks toward the train. Most of the time it's early in the morning, so no one sees them, which means we can't identify them until someone gets reported missing. One guy was identified by a chunk of his collarbone because he had a tattoo and that's all that was left. And that's only the train track suicides. We've had people wander into the woods and hang/shoot themselves and not be found for months when hunters find what's left of them. We've had people jump off overpasses onto the interstate, jump off cliffs into shallow water, crash on purpose, etc. The amount of people who commit suicide here is unreal. It's probably because it's a poor town full or depressing drunks, but one night my friend and I were reading about the train tracks that run through town, and apparently a bunch of the workers laying the railroad died from some toxic chemicals. And we think they haunt our town and make people kill themselves. Our town is located at the bottom of a mountaintop where a Christian cathedral and basilica was built. The holy place is a pilgrimage destination that people usually visit on the 1st of May. For those who wish to take the natural way to the top, there is a pathway that starts from our town, into a very lush woods up until you reach the cathedral. A truly tranquil and enjoyable experience. Until the incident. A local religious girl in her 20s from our town takes the woods path regularly to the mountaintop. She's done so for years. On the way to the top, there is a small monastery with a lush garden tended by a hired foreign concierge since many years. The girl has repeatedly crossed path with him and had talked to him on many occasions, usually just exchanging greetings on her way up. One day, the girl went on her pilgrimage and never returned. A local search party as well as the police went looking for her. People from the cathedral and the monastery have also helped in the search. Even the gardener himself, as he knew the way around the woods. Everyone thought the foreign concierge had done it. But the fact is he was the most cooperative man out there and helped the search party until they found the girl dead. Her arms separated from her body in a nearby bush. Signs of struggle are evident on her corpse. That was an attempted rape. There were no witnesses in the middle of the woods, no cameras to help. Even if she screamed, no one would hear her. This was going to be another unsolved cold case. Until someone took a deep look at the cooperative concierge's hands. They were too clean for someone who has been working all day in the garden and hasn't come home yet. With a deep inspection, dried blood was seen under his fingernails and they arrested him. He eventually confessed to the rape and crime. And was imprisoned. The locals wanted a capital punishment in the middle of the town. They were denied it. After a few years, A prison incident happened and the murderer escaped and fled back to his home country. A memorial monument is now placed on the natural path up near the place she died. A sad and creepy reminder of what the holy pilgrimage can sometimes turn into. Well, it's not my town, but a village where my grandpa grew up. The village is pretty abandoned now and has around 3 families that still live there. So, there is a house near the center of the village, where no one has lived for at least 2 generations now. People say that there's a cursed treasure there hidden inside one of the walls of the house. The story behind the treasure is that during the Ottoman occupations of Serbia, one unnamed Ottoman officer was passing through the village with a pot of so-called treasures. When he arrived at the house, he asked the people living there if he could get some water for his travels. The people who lived there told him they will bring his some, and that he should rest near the tree in the yard. When he got off the horse, a couple men attacked him and tied him to the tree. Then they robbed him of the pot of treasures, and mercilessly tortured him for hours before killing him by hanging him on that same tree. It is said that during his final breaths he cursed them and the treasure, that whoever touches that pot will meet the same fate. The men who attacked and tortured him are said that they have died fairly young, and that the man who lived in that house hung himself on that tree. Years later there are at least 2 people who are known to have tried to dig around that house in the 1900s, and both of them hung themselves on that tree. Now I cannot be certain that there really was a tortured Ottoman back in the day, but the people who killed themselves on that tree in the 1900s are definitely real, since my grandfather knew both of them. These days no one tries to test the story there. Back in the 80s a couple were driving a motorcycle when they were stopped by 3 men, who then raped the woman while forcing her husband to watch, then they killed both. The police caught them not so long after. The same night that they were caught, a mob of 300+ people gathered in front of the police department, broke in and told the sheriff, "You guys did an excellent job, now leave it to us." The mob broke the cell where the 3 men were, beat them up and attached them, alive, into cars and dragged them for 4 miles until a park in the middle of the city, where they set them on fire, alive, while everybody was clapping and cheering. Almost nobody talks about it now. I don't know if it's considered a dark secret, but in the county I lived in from ages 10 to 18, we had a soldier die under some extremely questionable circumstances. They said he was high/drunk/experiencing mental distress and raided a nursery, the plant kind. They claimed he was attacked by wasps and ran. He called 911 several times and claimed that someone was chasing him and was trying to kidnap him. In the last 911 call, he said everything was fine suddenly. Just 14 to 15 minutes later, he was struck by a woman who stopped and called 911. He was ran over 2 more times and died. The autopsy showed no signs of bee or wasp stings. The connection to the nursery is due to the fact that it was just up the road from where he died. The place was ransacked, pizza eaten, money taken. But his wallet and phone were sitting on the counter, undisturbed. However, the family was not okay with that explanation, especially because he had previously texted that there were some problems with the local boys since the soldier wasn't from this part of the state. So the family had a private investigator look into it. They analyzed the 911 recordings, and found several instances of other people talking in the background, though most of it couldn't be made out. Except one. In the 911 call where he told the operator that everything was fine, a male voice could be heard saying, "Tell her." And the nursery? There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no footprints that lead back to the soldier, even though his phone and wallet were there in the building. A lot of people, his family included, think he was killed by some of the local guys there after they got into a fight about something. They chased him down, and caught him. He was able to run again after the final 911 call, and was hit by a driver while trying to get help. And the police in the county covered the entire thing up because the boys involved were connected to the department somehow. Of the 3 drivers, none were charged for hitting/running over him. I think only the first driver stopped, but it was discovered that one of the other drivers was connected to the department either through family or friendship. It's a crazy story, but you can look it up. Just search Austin McGuff. I wouldn't be too surprised since there is a lot of shady stuff happening in small town police departments, including covering up rapes that officers commit. I really hope his family gets him justice. I don't live in this town anymore, but it was where I grew up. However, this happened way before my time. 1929 to be exact. A man, named A.J. Wijkstra had a small farm. He also hunted and was very proficient with a carbine, rifle. He started an affair with a woman, whose husband was in prison. After a couple of weeks she abandoned her children, all 6 of them, to live with A.J. Because Altje, the woman, left her children, the police wanted to talk with her, and make sure she goes back to her children. In the winter, Freezing 18 degrees Celsius, the police goes to the farm store. However, to prevent the police from taking the woman, he shoots and kills them. In total, 4 policemen from the towns in the area tried to take her and all of them lost their lives. From shooting, and I think from one the throat was slit. This happened in a small town in the Netherlands, and there's a Dutch movie about the whole ordeal, which is called Het Teken van het Beest, The Mark of the Beast. In the end he got hurt as well, fled to a hospital, and got captured there. Originally sentenced to life in prison, which was later reduced to 20 years. He never however saw life outside of prison again, since he died of TBC in the 1940s. This one is kind of recent to my state and me. Last year a wealthy woman went missing amidst a messy divorce with her husband. I knew her and her children well. I taught 3 of her 5 kids how to swim for the past 5-ish summers. We were told to never let the children leave with the father, even though he showed up and tried to take the kids a few times. She was a very sweet woman and everyone was kind of shocked she disappeared. Weeks go on and no trace of her. Finally they start investigating the husband and his new girlfriend. The investigation goes on and on, he denies any kind of involvement. Later they find pieces of the woman's clothing in dumpsters scattered around the state but no trace of her. Eventually they trace a bloodstain to the garage of the husband's house. Some bullshit story of how there was a fight and she got pushed. Finally when it seems they have a case against him, he turns up unconscious in his own garage, in the driver's seat of his car with the car running, with a note. He was still alive and they rushed him to a hospital with a hyperbolic chamber. A few days later he died in the hospital. Never admitted to murdering his wife, but fuck me, did that piece of shit deserve worse than what he got. He killed his wife who he only married for the money. Took her from her 5 children, and then killed himself. Leaving the mother's grandparents to raise 5 children without their parents. May he rot in hell for eternity. We grew up in one of the worst neighborhoods in my state. Crime. Gangs. Murders. But this was the 80s, so you still went out to go swim or ride bikes. We were raised to be extremely street smart and fight like little savages if anyone laid a hand on us, but 3 guys in an ironically named safety cab still almost snatched me off the street in broad daylight. Anyway, 80s childhood being what it was, we used to ride our bikes everywhere. Our home street was divided into 3 parts. The upper and middle parts were relatively okay in the daytime. The lower part was off limits no matter what, BC, that's where the sex offenders and drug dealers lived. We moved out finally and went somewhere a lot safer. Years pass. Our old neighborhood makes the news every so often for various outrages. One day, I saw in the newspaper that a woman had recently been found dead in her house. She'd been dead for a month on her couch. Sad ending, but nothing awful like murder. However, when authorities showed up to deal with the situation, they discovered a big slab of cement in a strange place in the backyard. A neighbor told them that they'd frequently seen her at night sitting near and talking to the slab. If you knew how weird the PPL were in our neighborhood were, you'd have brushed this off as yet another whack job. Turns out it was her husband. Only they weren't legally married, so when he died, suspected of natural causes. No idea how they arrived at that. She couldn't live without his social security check every month, so she buried him in the backyard and kept up the pretense that he was alive with his out-of-state relatives. We used to ride by that house frequently when he was already buried in the yard. Oh, 1980s. Rural Iowa, where everybody knows everybody. 3 people worked together, a man, his wife, and a male friend cousin. Wife stayed homesick one day. Man went to work. Friend also called in. Man went to check on his wife during lunch and found friend and wife in bed together. Rural Iowa, so untreated mental illness was rampant. Man lost his shit, shot the wife, friend, and himself. The wife survived. The man's funeral was huge because everyone loved him. He really was a sweet, sweet dude, so people came from our town and every town nearby. Friend's funeral was essentially just his parents. Wife, her family, and the friend's family all left town the second she got out of the hospital. No one speaks of the friend anymore, in a way that makes it seem like he never even existed. Shortly before I moved away, a lovely young lady again, someone nobody could find a thing to criticize about, hard to do in rural Iowa, was shot outside of her workplace. She was called in last minute to open the bank as her coworker was sick. As she was unlocking the door, a man walked up and shot her in the face. He was never found and it was labeled as a robbery gone wrong. Except he didn't rob the bank, or her, so my theory is that it was someone who was pissed at her coworker, but being bundled up for Iowa winter, he didn't realize it was a different girl. Everyone had connections to everyone, including the police, so it was very quickly brushed under the rug. I fled that state shortly after her murder because I found out these one-offs were shockingly common. The week I moved there, a young female jogger was picked up, raped, and killed. Shortly before I moved there, an elderly neighbor lady's house was broken into and she was shot and killed. Only the jogger's murderer was caught, but I genuinely believe that only happened because the guy wasn't white. In the 2 years I lived there was a shocking number of murders that just got quietly brushed aside almost the second the words "the suspect is a white male" were mentioned. I live in a small town in Alaska. About 20 to 30 years ago, a high school student went missing. For a town of only a few thousand people, this was obviously a big deal. It was the night of her birthday, and she had a party somewhere. At about 1 to 2 a.m. she left the party and walked home. She never made it. Within a few days, police found her body underneath a bridge in a heavily forested area. She was raped and strangled to death. This was a massive story throughout the region, as murders like this are extremely uncommon. The police arrested a mentally disabled man in connection with the murder, and I believe he was imprisoned until they found evidence that acquitted him from the crime. Turns out that the police department, which has a long history of being corrupt, racist, abusive, etc. to this day, big problem throughout the state, coerced a confession from him. Unfortunately, nobody could find any more evidence relating to her murder and the case went cold. Until about 2 months ago. Due to some sort of new forensics technique, I don't know any of the specifics, law enforcement got a DNA hit on a man living in Arkansas. Turns out he moved there from my town about 10 to 15 years ago. Police showed up to his house to ask him a few questions and he refused to comply. They couldn't do anything without a warrant, so they left. It took them about 30 minutes to get a search warrant, and when they entered the house they found his body, with his skull blown to pieces. Turns out the piece of shit knew he was probably fucked and decided to face a shotgun rather than incarceration. The guy was apparently a family friend of the girl and was a city worker for years with her father. Nobody suspected him at all since apparently he had the demeanor of just a regular, nice, quiet guy. He followed the girl from the party, carried out his sick plan, and got away with it for decades. Sucks he was able to take the coward's way out, but I hope the family of the girl found some sort of closure at least. A girl I grew up with on the same block. I went to a few of her birthdays, but she always seemed negative and a troubled soul even though she had everything she needed at home. 10 years ago she was on the way to the big city airport with her friends to head out east for Christmas. And her psycho ex-BF stalked them. Their car pulled over to see what was up with him and he shot and killed her and her 2 other friends. One of her GFS was shot in the spine but not killed. She is still alive and taking a lot of therapy. Another guy I went to school with was crushed and killed by a wall falling on him. He was building a house and it was a windy day. Another just passed last week from a lifelong struggle with colon cancer. I knew he was sick since I was 15 because of his gray skin, but no one thought to check until years later. I'm 30 now, living in the big city, but it's crazy the amount of people I grew up with from the small town who have passed on already. It makes you wonder. It could have happened to you. But you're still alive. Our town is nestled in the hills below a popular ski resort in Australia. Around the early 1900s to mid-1900s we had a massive number of mining explorations and there's upwards of 500 shafts dug in the bush around us. If you dug them out you would find things like mercury, silver and gold. About 10 years ago some people stumbled upon one of the more shallow shafts and found something a bit odd in the dirt nearby, a woman's scarf. The people who found it took it to the authorities and they investigated. At the bottom of the shaft was a skeleton wearing women's clothes. Eventually it was figured out, whether by DNA or deductive reasoning I'm uncertain, that said skeleton was a local cross-dressing man, who had been doing the dirty with some of the police, and eventually they took him out to the mine shaft and threw him down there alive. A few months after this discovery there was a big shakeup with the older police and a handful were cycled out or moved to another town, but also a couple of them disappeared. People go missing up here either by accident or intentionally, sometimes of their own volition, on almost a monthly basis. Those 500 mine shafts probably have thousands of bodies in them. Not my town, but it's a story I heard from a guy I was buying a car from. I was doing a bit of work to the car in his driveway just to make sure it will be safe for the road, and he was talking to me. The guy was 80-something and this happened when he was in his early 20s. There was a foster home that at the time had like 100 kids in it, and one night a group of 10 men broke in and went door to door raping and killing everyone. The kids there were anywhere between basically toddlers and 17-year-olds. Nobody knew about it till a cleaning lady came and saw everything and reported it to the police. About a year into the investigation, when the police had basically no leads, one of the guys committed suicide, and in his suicide note were the names of all the people that were with him. It's said that the guy who first learned about the note went around town and told everyone. The entire town all gathered and broke into the homes of the people who did it, and they were taken into the middle of the city and beaten and tortured for a few hours until they were shot and left there. Up until the day where I bought the car from him, there was only like 50 people in the town who were alive back then and were still in town. It's said that the cops were paid off by the guys who did it, and that's why they were not found sooner, and the only reason the word of that note got out is because a new guy who didn't know about them being paid off was the first on the scene and the first to find the note. I have no way to confirm it, and he said that he didn't remember all the details, but he remembered that it was horrible. About 6 or so years ago, a school bus stopped to let a child off of the bus. The woman driving an SUV behind the bus goes around on the right side. This was in the US, meaning the woman went off the road, hitting and killing a little girl. I'm wanting to say it either missed her brother or maybe her brother was at the door waiting on her. Either way, I think her brother witnessed it. I can't remember if the woman was trying to pass the bus or not, but I'm wanting to say that she wasn't paying attention, maybe on the phone/makeup, and swerved to avoid hitting the bus. So days go by and word gets out that she wasn't charged, and I think not even arrested. We didn't hear anything about a court case, or charges dropped or anything. I don't even know if her name came out. Everyone speculated that she knew a judge or someone who got her off the hook. A few years later, there was a movement to bring justice for the little girl, but nothing came from it, unfortunately. It was just very weird how the woman got out of that one when her negligence clearly led to the death of a poor little girl. And what bothers me the most is that there's no explanation. Did the police or prosecutors do something wrong which would have the case thrown away so they never brought charges? Did the woman actually know someone who could get her out of it? Or was she in something like Wijkstra and they couldn't expose her identity? Just so many unanswered questions for such a tragedy. One night, I'm assuming in the 50s, 80s, a mother, in the boonies of my town, decided that she was going to escape from her abusive husband. She lived in a poor house with said husband, and her newborn baby. Due to her new baby, the mother realized that she couldn't stay in such a household and have her child at risk. It was a stormy night, and after planning, the mother escaped the house with her baby in her arms. Inevitably, her husband found out that she was leaving. She slipped on the wet grass whilst running up a hill, and decided to hide until her husband found her. Knowing she would undergo terrible or fatal treatment from her husband, she didn't want her baby to suffer in the hands of him once she was gone. She found a heavy rock, and crushed her newborn baby with it as it bawled, the audible path that her husband was following to her. The mother was found, and murdered by her husband. Rumor has it, that if you return to that hill on a stormy night, you'll hear the wailing of the baby that faced that horrible demise. There's no actual proof that this happened, but I have had people that I've known tell me that they heard the crying upon coming to the hill on stormy nights. I grew up in a small village in Michigan with a pop of like 6,000 people and everyone's related, lol. There was a bunch crazy dark stuff that happened from the mid-90s up until recently. When I was in middle school, there was a teen shot and killed downtown after getting in a fight. He got beat up, went home and brought back his dad's gun and shot and killed one of the other kids. It was really sad and instantly destroyed 2 families. The next year, a kid from my grade was hanging out with a group at one of his friend's house. The friend went upstairs and got his dad's gun. One friend was messing around with it, not knowing it was loaded, and pointed it at a kid and shot him right in between his eyes. Craziest part is the kid lived and the 9mm bullet followed his nasal path and exited out his neck. He has 2 tiny little round scars at the entrance and exit wounds and didn't suffer any long-term effects. He actually came back to school and graduated with us. I never saw the kid who shot him ever again, and I don't have a clue what happened to him. The next year, 2 boys from my class and a girl from the next town over jumped a train that took them north to the next big city. They got off in a bad neighborhood and went looking for a way to call and have someone come pick them up. Unfortunately, a group of guys found them and took them to a nearby park that was overgrown and not used. They raped the girl, then lined all of them up and shot each one in the head. If I remember right, they had a shotgun that jammed and ended up using a small caliber pistol to shoot them execution style. Since it was a small caliber, only one of the boys died and the other 2 played dead, weren't shot again. They were able to get help and the guys were eventually caught. There was a lot of racial tension around it because the kids were white and the guys who raped and murdered were black. I saw the other boy who lived one time after, and I have no idea whatever happened to him. They ended up writing an article in Time magazine on the story. After that, it was either a year or 2 after, and a family at the end of my road was murdered. An older couple and their son and daughter-in-law, or the other way around, were all beat to death with a claw hammer. It took a few weeks to catch the guy, and it turned out that he broke into their house to steal money for drugs, not knowing anyone was home. I don't remember exactly what happened, but he proceeded to beat each person to death only using claw hammer. My friend's mom went there to get the cat after it happened, and supposedly she found it licking up the blood that had soaked through the floor. Not sure if that's true, but there had to have been a ridiculous amount of blood from smashing in 4 people's heads. Probably about 10 years after all this happened, my mom was driving home and passed a bunch of police cars in front of a home on her dead-end street. She watched the news and found out that a guy was murdered at night when he answered a knock at his back door. The guy was married and his wife was home at the time, so she told the police everything that happened. Turns out the guy who got murdered had just got out of prison after serving time for molesting a kid. Everyone assumed that it was his victim who came to get revenge, but they never caught the guy. Fast forward several years and the guy gets tracked down out west in Wyoming or something and gets brought back to Michigan to face his charges. Everyone forgot about it until the story broke and no one could believe that they caught the guy. Anyways, those are a few of the craziest dark secret things that happened in my hometown, and you would never think there could be that much violence in such a small town. It's still a great place to live, but having all of that happen really made me think if it's a good place to live, and I ended up moving away for 10 years. I decided to move my family back recently to be closer to family, and I haven't regretted it at all because I've learned that it doesn't really matter where you live, crazy shit always happens.